Historically, I've been somewhat neutral on IEMs as a whole, and the simple reason for that is that whilst they are fantastic for any situation in which you need portability and isolation, so at the office, on the bus, those kind of things, just sat at my desk using my home setup, I didn't typically feel that you got the same level of sound quality from an IEM as you would from a full-size open-back set of headphones. But in the last year or so, that's really been changing for two main reasons. The first is that there are certain IEMs which just do things you can't do in a full-size set of headphones. The Mess Mark II is a good example of this. I absolutely love those because they have this bone conduction driver which just presents things in a completely unique way that I've not heard on any other headphone or speaker or anything. Nothing at all. And I love them. There is a Patreon-exclusive review of the Mess Mark I and Mess Mark II up on Patreon if you wanted to watch it, by the way. But also because IEMs seem to be advancing in terms of sound quality and value for money particularly so much faster than headphones are. And not just in any particular price bracket. At the cheaper end of things, you've got stuff like this. This is the Moondrop Kato, which I was sent by mistake. I'd not seen anything about them when I received them. I was supposed to be getting the SMSL SU9N from Shenzhen, but they accidentally sent these first. And they said, well, do you want to review those as well? And I went, yeah, okay. So I opened them up, looked at the build quality, the quality of the cable and everything, and then gave them a listen, and I thought, okay, well, I'm guessing these are probably about $800, because these sound really good. No, $200. $200. And I was very confused, because these are brilliant. But at the more expensive end of things as well, there's historically been stuff like the Enola VX, which is a very technically impressive IEM, but this sets a new benchmark. This is something else. The tuning's different from the Enola VX, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But just from a pure technical performance perspective, this is one of the most impressive transducers generally that I've heard. They are absolutely amazing. But before we talk about sound quality, let's talk about what you get in the box. The box itself is fairly unassuming. There's not much on it, which I actually quite like. I like the fact this isn't flashy because it means that it's less attractive to thieves. It's not going to get nicked or anything. You can put this in your bag and not worry about it too much, because some stuff has really nice packaging, but it immediately looks expensive to everyone else, which isn't always a good thing. The inside is where the premium stuff starts. You get this lovely velvet type finish on the backing material here, the metal case presented beautifully to you, and a metal plate which says Symphonium Helios. The case is a circular metal case, which is nice because that's going to protect from crush damage much better than a lot of the fabric or plastic cases would, because those, even though they're hard and will protect from impact damage, they're not going to protect it if it gets stepped on or squashed in a bag or anything like that. And inside, two leather inserts, or foam inserts rather, so that it's not going to get scratched or anything when the IEMs are jostling about inside, or the IEMs are not going to get scratched rather. Nothing on the sides, but that's just because the cable will be wrapped around them, so you don't need it. And then on the bottom, you have this drawer, which has a metal serial number card on it, and a signed thank you letter which says, "Thank you for purchasing this pair of in-ear monitors. We hope that you'll enjoy it as much as we have enjoyed crafting it for you." And I've certainly enjoyed these a lot so far. You also get a selection of tips. I have tip rolled these quite a bit, and I've settled on some foam tips. These just sort of sounded the best, particularly in the treble region. So this review is based on using these foam tips here. So let's put the packaging away and talk about the IEMs themselves. The first thing to say about the Helios in terms of its build quality is that the cable is fantastic. A lot of headphone companies, even at the really high end, have just awful cables. The Hi-Fi Man Zasvara cable still gives me nightmares. This is lovely. It's super flexible, super malleable, just soft, no microphonics whatsoever. It just flows like water. It's lovely. And it looks good. I think this copper finish is really, really nice. So they've done a really good job with the cable. You get a balanced 4.4mm one and a single-ended one as well, if I don't chuck that off the desk. The splitter is sleek and clean with an adjustment ring if that's your thing. The only gripe I really have about it is that at the top here, this part's not molded or heat shrunk or anything like that. So it is just sort of flexible free, whereas on most IEMs that would have some kind of method of keeping it in this hook shape. So this one's got a heat shrink, for example, so it doesn't deform away from that. It just stays in that hook shape. Whereas this, the cable doesn't necessarily sit super tightly over your ear. But there's a reason they've done that. And that's that the IEMs are huge. These are fucking enormous, is the only way I can put it. If I take the right Kato and the right Helios, you can see a difference here There's a bit of a size comparison. But then when I turn them this way, you can really see just how much bigger the Helios are. They go so much deeper. They're at this kind of wonky angle, which makes it quite tricky as well. They're just enormous. These are just absolutely huge. They're not uncomfortable, though. They're just huge. The Katos, when I put them in my ear, this part goes all the way in. And so then this bit sits snug against my outer ear, and it doesn't move, because it's just pressing against everything like that. Whereas on the Helios, though, this part goes in, that bit's not touching my outer ear, and so it does actually kind of wriggle about like that. That's a bit annoying, and I did ask on Discord if they potentially would think about making a smaller version of these. They said they couldn't do it without compromising on sound quality, which is understandable. It's much better to have a bigger IM that sounds better than a smaller one that sounds shit. But it'd ironically actually be better if they could make it just a little bit bigger by extending this part out so that when this is in, it presses against your outer ear and gives it some support. Because right now, the whole thing is just kind of floating from the tip itself rather than any of the body of the IM actually making contact with and sitting on your outer ear. So would be nice to see a future revision with just a bit more material here. Rather than changing any of the internals, just make it so that it actually, you know, sits on your outer ear like that and doesn't move about. That would be nice. The actual quality of the build, though, is stellar. This finish and the text is so sharp. The whole shape is just sleek and understated, but clearly premium and high-end at the same time. It's not trying to be flash, it's not trying to be quirky, it just looks nice. I really love how this is built, and they feel really sturdy as well. It feels like you'd have to lob these at a wall in order to try and break them. So build quality is great, cable is great, comfort's fine, but the size needs a little bit of sort of not necessarily work, just some kind of compromise, some kind of method of supporting it more, or if possible making it smaller, but just supporting it more would make it work. Lastly, before we talk about sound quality, these are surprisingly hard to drive, to kind of a ridiculous extent for an IM. I'm going to pop these on single-ended on the OR, low gain, pot maxed, and I'm going to control it with the preamp. This is the gold point. Each of these steps is 1.5 dB, and I'm going to show you how loud I have to get these in comparison to the Katos. So just playing this track. About 20. I'm at about 20. If I go to the Katos, okay, same again, low gain, pot maxed, whack the volume on that down. If we go back a bit and hit play. About 14 this time. So we went from 20 on the Helios to about 14 on the Kato. There is a step in between each of those numbers, so 12 steps in total, and they're 1.5 dB steps. So the Helios needs about 18 dB higher volume than the Kato does in order to get to the same output level. Which, to put that in perspective, means these need 8 times the voltage and about 64 times the power of the Katos, assuming the same impedance. So 64 times the power, which is kind of nuts. You don't need an OR or a massively powerful headphone amp to run them. In fact, I've been running them quite a bit off the Chord Mojo too, and they sound fantastic on that. This runs them fine, but it's close to the upper volume control on that, and there are definitely going to be some dongles which can't run these. So make sure you've got at least a reasonably powerful source, because a lot of dongles are just not going to be able to run these. Right, let's talk about why I love these so much. So, how would I describe the sound signature of the Symphonium Helios overall? Well, if I had to use 3 words, it would be control, speed, and fun. Because this sets a new benchmark for technical performance at the $1,000-ish price point. It, for me, takes the cake from the Enola VX. It is an immensely resolving IEM. The macro dynamics on this, the sheer speed and force of slam is crazy. But it's not a neutral tuned IEM. It's very, very technically impressive, and the detail retrieval is nuts. But it's not going to satisfy those wanting a neutral tuning like the Enola VX. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on your preferences. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the overall tuning and frequency response of this IEM step by step and talk about some of the pros and cons, because this is really, really, really good at certain things, to the extent that even though I've got the 1266 and the Sysvara and the HD800 and a bunch of other headphones and stuff here, for certain tracks I found myself reaching for these. But in being good at so good at those, it's also not so great at other things. You can't be the best at everything. It's just not how it works, unfortunately. You've got to make some trade-offs. And this does make some trade-offs. But they're trade-offs which are going to make this a fantastic IEM for a lot of people. So this is a V-shaped IEM. But the V-shaped tuning is done quite differently from most V-shaped transducers in general, not just IEMs. There's a frequency response chart on screen now. This was taken by headphones.com. And what you'll notice is that whilst this is a V-shaped IEM, the V doesn't really kind of come down into the mid-range. It's not even towards the top like some headphones are, particularly if they're doing the soundstage dip, as some people refer to it. This has the bottom of the V kind of closest to the lower end of the mid-range, and more to the point, where it starts rising up out of that V or even slightly U-shape, it does it very late, low down. And so whilst you get this big rise into the sub-bass, you don't get a lot of mid-bass going along with it, which is interesting because most V-shaped stuff would have quite a lot of mid-bass. It's a bass shelf overall, not just that lower frequency area. And what that means is that the Helios delivers a immensely deep-reaching sub-bass accompanied by exceptionally clean, articulate treble with no overdone mid-bass to muddy things up. It's incredibly punchy, it's incredibly dynamic, but it retains this immense sense of clarity at the same time, which is fantastic. So to start things off, let's talk about just how deep this thing goes, because sub-bass is kind of the defining feature of this. It sounds incredible. And a track like the hollow 16-bit remix from Bjork really shows this off. This is an interesting track if you have a powerful subwoofer or anything that just does sub-bass properly. Play this and let it shake your skull a little bit. If you've got any fillings which you want loosened, this is a pretty good track for doing that. So starting at about 16 seconds in. Oh, Jesus Christ, that's deep. It's so deep and so forceful, but it's so clean. It doesn't feel like the driver is loose or flabby or struggling or anything like that. There's just this sense of clarity even to sub-bass elements, which is pretty unusual because a lot of bassier IEMs or even more neutral IEMs like the Katos are a lovely IEM. The low end is kind of slightly blended together, whereas this just feels so tactile the whole way through. In fact, if I just go back a little bit and find out exactly what frequency this was. So that's down at about 30 hertz, so getting real close to the bottom end of what we can hear there, and it's just so far forward, but it doesn't feel like it's breaking a sweat. It sounds absolutely amazing, and this makes it fantastic for any kind of track, particularly electronic genres that require a lot of fast, controlled, and deep-reaching sub-bass, both for intermittent, punchy elements like percussion and drums or synths, and also the more continuous things like deep church organs and that kind of instrument. It handles both of those scenarios with absolute ease. A good track for showing off both of these elements simultaneously is The Phoenix by Pyramid and Willie Wesley. And that's because at about 2 minutes and 30 seconds in, you have both more staccato elements, a kick synth which is fast, punchy, impactful, and shows off just how quick a driver can sound, because it can go anywhere from feeling lightning fast to a bit like being punched through a pillow. But it's also got more legato, ongoing, continuous elements, which is an oscillating low sub-bass synth, really. And that can end up sounding flabby or not particularly present, depending on how technically capable a headphone is or how the tuning's done. And it's amazing just how effortlessly controlled and present both of those elements sound on the Helios, which is something that not many headphones, let alone IEMs, can do. Because you go on something like an HD800, and it's incredibly quick, snappy, articulate, detailed, and punchy, but it doesn't have that sub-bass presence. It rolls off, it doesn't really have that body and weight to it. And then something else, like a Meze Empyrean, that's got that body, that weight, that warmth, that lushness, and it's impactful, but it's not as articulate and snappy. And so it's a little bit more like being punched through a pillow rather than actually being smacked around the face as hard as you can. Whereas this is doing both elements in just such a sublime fashion. So let's play from 2 minutes and 30 seconds in. In fact, let's go to about 1 minute and 20 because this is the best part.
Start a motherfucking riot. About to start a motherfucking riot. Power still rising, still rising. Motherfucking riot. About to start a motherfucking riot. About to start a motherfucking.
It's so fast, it's so controlled, it's so punchy, and it just doesn't feel like there's anything holding back the cleanliness of it, or the extension, or the weight, or anything. This has some of the best bass I have heard in any IEM, and this is an all BA. There are no dynamic drivers in this, and that boggles my mind. It doesn't make sense, because this has absolutely no elements of BA bass to it. I mean, even the Enola VX, that's a fantastic IEM in most regards, it definitely still had that BA bass. This does not. This redefines how good low-end can be in an IEM. The slight issue, though, is that just because you don't have that kind of mid-bass bleed, this is a blessing and a curse. The good thing is that that lack of mid-bass means that there is a sense of clarity to this which is not found in many other tunings. It means that you can play anything and you get that impactfulness, that weight, and that force, but you don't get that mid-range congestion that can sometimes accompany particularly multi-driver BA IEMs. But the downside is that you also don't really have all that much presence in the mid-range, and it can sometimes, depending on how wide a spectrum a particular instrument or element occupies, end up leaving the sub-bass just a little bit detached. But not much. That's something which I've only noticed on a small handful of tracks, but for the most part, you don't really notice it too much. Mid-range on the Helios is where things start to get a little bit mixed. And it's not that the mid-range or the timbre even here is bad. It's not. In fact, it's quite good. It's just that there's not a huge amount of it. It's quite pushed back. And so if you are a timbre head, you prefer a lusher, warmer, denser sound signature overall, this isn't probably going to be to your liking. That doesn't mean it doesn't work with these kinds of tracks, though. In fact, if you play something quite mid-range heavy, and even quite a busy track with a lot of stuff throughout the whole frequency spectrum, like Andrew Bird's Puma, it kind of just gives you a different perspective. Because if I play 30 seconds or so of this...
It's just a tumor, and she was radioactive for 7 days. How I wanted to be holding her anyway.
When I listen to this on something like a Sysvara, my attention's drawn to the character of the male vocals, of the guitar, and the sort of spaciousness of the mix. Whereas on this, because the mid-range is quite pushed back, and the macrodynamics, the leading edge transients are kind of emphasized, my attention's being drawn towards the percussion, the leading edge of the guitar plucks. And in fact, there's a part in this track where he is plucking at some guitar strings, I think it's 130, and let's just check this is the right part. And those guitar plucks sound so tactile, so they're so much more distinct than they are on a lot of other headphones. Because at that point, I'm not so much caring about the timbre. In fact, it's quite clear that the guitar has been sort of processed a bit. There's almost like a radio effect over it. But that leading edge is sublime on these. These feel like they just have endless energy. They just want to jump. They want to move about. They want to be quick. But it's not sterile. A lot of headphones which kind of have, well, less of a mid-range emphasis is probably the best way to put it, end up sounding sterile, boring, lifeless, dull, and that's far from what I'd describe these as. The mid-range on these is pushed back, but the quality of it is still excellent. The actual timbre of elements is wonderful, it's just that they're just a little bit further away from you, effectively. There's just a little bit less in focus. It's not that the actual character of things is in any way diminished. And so I can listen to stuff like this. This is Ezio's Family from Cassini Project, and it's basically all strings and female vocals, and it sounds beautiful. Every element in this sounds really quite close to true to life. I don't quite get the same spatial effect on any IM, not just the Helios, as I do with certain open backs, but the character of each individual element is wonderful. again, I'm kind of being a little bit more drawn to the leading edge of even well, piano is a percussion instrument, fun fact, but I don't feel like anything's missing. This is the kind of distinction that I want to make, is that there are certain headphones which have basically missing character or missing quality to the mid-range. This, it's not missing. It's really good. It's just quite pushed back. That's all. So if you prefer a much lusher signature, these aren't going to be for you. But if you're worried about the actual quality of the mid-range, don't. It's fantastic. Let's move on to the treble, because the treble's really, really good. So as we start kind of sloping up and increasing in amplitude in the frequency response again, treble is more prominent. And it's remarkably flat. That's one thing that's interesting about this, is there's not really any massive peaks or anything anywhere, at least according to the measurements I saw. And that kind of shows through the actual sound. The treble as a whole sounds very, very controlled, very, almost, it has a sweetness to it. And it just sounds effortless. Effortless is a word I keep coming back to, which almost betrays how energetic and punchy these things are. But I say effortless because it just doesn't feel like these are held back. It doesn't feel like these are struggling. It feels like you could just keep turning these up and up and up and up, or throw more complex and difficult tracks at them, and they wouldn't break a sweat. So let's go with something which has got quite a few different elements in it. Plenty is always a good one. Let's do Electric Sunrise. Two things, in fact, three things off the bat. Firstly, resolution's nuts. The actual detail retrieval of these is absolutely up there with even some really high-end, full-size open-back headphones. It's wonderful. The level of information that these can present to you is kind of unparalleled compared to a lot of IEMs. I've tried a lot of even very, very expensive IEMs. I mean, stuff like a Mason FS sounds wonderful and all sorts of things. That does some really cool stuff. But the resolution's not any better than this. This is a very, very resolving IEM. Second thing is that whilst I typically, I don't think I found many IEMs at all that I would say have soundstage, that can actually throw things away from you in a convincing placement as such. But the sense of just general airiness and openness, thanks to the excellent upper treble extension, is really good. It doesn't feel closed in. It doesn't feel intimate. It doesn't feel kind of muted, which is an effect that you get if on headphones which have a bit of a cut-off upper treble extension. These just feel open. And then the third thing is separation. The separation on these and the level of detail that these can continue to provide even when the track gets busy is fantastic. Now, this is an element which I've kind of praised on quite a few products I've reviewed recently, but it's just because I've reviewed a few things which do this really well recently. There are a lot of headphones, a lot of even DACs and amps which don't do this very well, which break down or get congested and struggle when the mix is busy. But here, even if we go to quite a busy part of the track where there's all sorts of grungy guitar and everything going on, all the while, the decay of that cymbal off to my right and everything is just perfectly clear. Decay is an interesting point to mention, actually, because if I just play this part a little bit more, the cymbals and the treble elements, the decay of those feels uncapped, is probably the best way to put it. It feels like it just goes on for as long as the actual recording demands. Whereas lower frequency stuff like drums in particular, it does feel like the decay is just a little bit cut off. Just a bit. And that's because, obviously, whilst you get that initial impact and everything, which as we described earlier is wonderful on these, the resulting kind of boom and resonance of the drum does bleed into the mid-range a bit, which on these is a little bit pushed back. And so it's perceived as being shortened. So the tuning of these is really quite interesting. V-shaped stuff is normally a little bit hit or miss. It does give you that fun, but it often isn't something that you'd necessarily want to listen to long term. Whereas I've had these here for a lot longer than they should have been. Sorry that these haven't gone out sooner. But I've just kept using them. I've just kept reaching for these even over very high performance headphones. It doesn't feel like these are really struggling in any one department, and it doesn't feel like any of the things that make these not so great for certain genres. I wouldn't necessarily listen to classical and stuff on these just because I want a little bit more of a mid-range forwardness on something like that. It doesn't feel like it's because of any technical deficiency or inability to do something. It feels like it's just a result of them tuning it in a very specific and tastefully done way. And that specific and tastefully done way makes it amazing for a lot of other tracks. Something like this kind of puts everything together. This is Next High by Mansionaire. This actually just came out the other week. This has got some punchy elements. It sounds spacious and airy and open. The voices are sweet and more into the treble, which suits this a little bit better. And it just sounds wonderful. I genuinely can't think of many other headphones which I would rather listen to this track on than the Helios.
I'm sick of living for the next high, tired of waiting for the night sky. I just wanna be with you all the time.
Fast, crystal clear, oodles of detail, open, sweet sounding. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. The only reason you shouldn't buy these is if you are addicted to mid-range and you want a much lusher sounding signature. Other than that, these are fantastic, and I want a pair. I really want a pair. If you'd like to talk to me or other Wiggly Air enthusiasts about music, gear, or anything in between, then join my Discord server. Or, if you're feeling supportive, then support me on Patreon or Subscribestar and get access to the private Telegram chat. A huge thank you to all of my supporters, especially my Crazy Summit 5 people, Chief Big Time, Dan Mellinger, Joe and Dizarasta, my Legend tier patrons, Chandler Bassett, Chris, CK Yozizawa Zoo, Dwayne Butler and Jidin the Shiba, and my Diamond tier patrons, Naivotsu, Beefy Fish, Clockmeister, Gizmo1K, Ixnay, King Jong-un, Luxifer, Nick McKay, Pokey, and Whitesea Studio. Thank you all so very much.